Hello everybody and welcome back to Now Let's Be Honest for our second video of the day covering the Chosen Season 3 trailer, which actually premiered only a few hours ago. If you haven't checked out my reaction video to that, be sure to go and watch that. And if you haven't watched the trailer yet, definitely go and watch that, because what we're about to do right now is we are going to do an in-depth breakdown. I have gotten a bunch of screenshots from this trailer and we are going to go through it moment by moment and see what we can get out of this. Once again, I will remind you, I haven't looked into all this sorts of behind the scenes stuff, and so if you've been tracking with their social media accounts and have seen all the behind the scenes stuff, you might know more things about this than I do. I am simply watching this from a fan's perspective who is watching this trailer blind and who is going to try to use my knowledge of the Gospels and my knowledge of the show and just the different stuff that I've seen here and there to try to figure out what we can expect in the Chosen Season 3. I hope you're ready for this. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get to it. Okay, so right off the bat, we have this dialogue between Jesus and Shmuel, or as many people like to say, Shmuel, because that's technically the right pronunciation, but Jesus and Shmuel, that's how I like pronouncing his name. And it starts off with Jesus talking to him, and he says, "You look troubled," to which Shmuel responds, "I am." Jesus says, "You're losing something. I know what that's like." To which Shmuel responds, "What are you losing?" Right? And so right off the bat, this is a brilliant way to just kind of draw us in to this thing, because we're trying to figure out what they're talking about here. And Jesus is most likely talking about how Shmuel is losing his power. And that is really the thing that's why he's being threatened. Because Shmuel, if you've been tracking with seasons 1 and 2, he is kind of the poster child of the opposition against Jesus so far from the Pharisees. He started off as a student of Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a little bit more, he was a bigger fan of Jesus. Shmuel went the opposite direction. And so here we have this moment where Jesus and Shmuel are talking to each other for the first time. It seems like they might have just run into each other walking down the road. We see, or maybe this is after the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not totally sure, because we see people departing, we see some Romans in the background, but they're confronting each other right here. And Jesus says, it seems like he's really just kind of pushing through Shmuel's defenses to try to get down to the heart behind all of this. And he's pointing out that you look troubled. Shmuel says he is, probably because he is troubled by what he thinks is false teachings and false prophecies on the part of Jesus. But Jesus is pointing out that it's not exactly that which is troubling Shmuel. Actually, it's the fact that he's losing something, specifically the power that he has and the respect that he has, because Jesus is actually the one rising up through the ranks. So rather than being like John the Baptist, who gladly set his power aside for Jesus to rise up, Shmuel sees Jesus as a threat. But then Jesus says, "I know what that's like." And Shmuel responds, "What are you losing?" And then we immediately have this cut to another scene, which is brilliantly, like, just as I was breaking down this trailer, I want to just give credit where credit's due to the cinematography team, because this really, like, the dialogue goes perfectly well with what we're seeing on the screen. But notice how this cuts directly to another scene with the same lighting and the same color grading and everything. And Jesus is even wearing the same clothing in these two scenes, but they're taking place at two different places, right? So we have where Jesus is talking to Shmuel, and then it immediately cuts to Jesus looking at a sealed tomb, right? There's a rock in front of this tomb. Jesus places his hand on it. And this is directly in response to Shmuel saying, "What are you losing?" And the idea is that even before Jesus responds, he's going to say the word time. Even before we get there, we see that Jesus is thinking about his death. And so we can already, like, this is how just the editing of this trailer is beautiful in and of itself, because it is allowing the audience to figure out what Jesus is thinking about even before he says it, right? We can anticipate him saying time just because from Jesus' perspective, from the moment he turned water into wine, he knew that it was like a ticking time bomb where he is slowly making his way to the cross. And so here we have Jesus crying as he places his hand on this stone because he knows that his time is coming soon. After that, before Jesus even says the word time, we have these quick cuts to all these different moments where we just kind of get an idea of what Jesus is probably thinking about. And these are different moments that come throughout the season, but it's beautifully placed right here in just quick vignettes before Jesus says the word time. We see a bunch of people splashing around Jesus and the disciples. Presumably, I'm assuming that this thing on top and the thing on bottom are from the same scene where somebody is probably getting baptized. That's probably my best guess here. They're out in the Sea of Galilee, I assume, and somebody just got baptized and they're splashing around having a great time, or maybe they're just goofing off. I don't know. The bottom picture right there where Jesus is hugging Judas, I believe that's Jesus there, hugging Judas, would incline me to think that this was a big moment such as a baptism, but the one on top makes it look like they're just kind of goofing off, so I'm not totally sure. On the right, at the top, we do have Jesus with his arms around Big James and Judas, and I'm not totally sure what they're talking about here, because once again, we don't have any dialogue from this particular scene, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is Jesus just giving them a teaching moment, or maybe it's shortly before he actually sends them out to go do their thing. I know that for those who've been watching the behind-the-scenes stuff, we kind of have an idea of who is being paired with who as they're going out to minister 2 by 2, because we're going to see that in this season, but I don't know exactly who's with who, so maybe Judas is going to be with Big James. I have no idea, but if you've been tracking with that, you might know better than I do. And then on the bottom right, and then at the very bottom, I think we have two scenes that come from the same moment, and I believe this is going to be the moment when Jesus is kicked out of his hometown of Nazareth. This is a very big moment in the Gospels where Jesus goes to his hometown and they reject him. And I think that would explain why Mary is reacting so violently here, and why Jesus is probably looking back at her. I wouldn't be surprised if these two moments are actually cut back to back with one another in the actual scene where Jesus is being escorted out of the synagogue, and they're really going to take him to the edge of a cliffside to try to throw him off the side. But he is not going to allow that to happen. But I think that's why Mary is reacting so violently, because her little boy is being taken away. And you have to realize that Mary has had to deal with this looming prophecy that was given to her whenever Jesus was just a little boy, where she was told that a sword would pierce her very soul as a result of Jesus being born. And so she's kind of known that something's going to happen that's going to really be hard on her. And I think that every time Jesus is put in harm's way, she has to remember that prophecy. One thing that's interesting, though, is that whenever you actually look at the Gospels, Jesus and his family have a very rocky relationship. And there were some scenes that were released earlier by the Chosen. I think they've since been taken down because they were supposed to just be for a short time period, but they actually show that we're going to be introduced to Jesus's brothers in this season. Maybe not, we might not see them face to face, I don't know about that, but we are going to be introduced to the idea of them, because we do know that Jesus had siblings, at least from the evangelical perspective. If you're from another faith tradition, you might hold that maybe these guys are Jesus's cousins or something like that, or step siblings. I personally would hold that they are his brothers, but we're going to be introduced to the idea of them there, and so we're going to get to see a little bit more of how his own family is rejecting him, which kind of fits with the whole idea of Nazareth rejecting him, because Nazareth was a really small town, so a lot of the people who were rejecting him would be his family. And then after all those flashes, we finally cut back to Jesus with his conversation with Shmuel, where he reveals what it is that he is losing, and he is losing time. And I'll be really interested to see how that conversation goes down between Jesus and Shmuel in the actual scene. Like, how will Shmuel respond to this? Because we know that he is saying this to him. It's not like they just did this, voiceover where Jesus is saying this. He is saying this to Shmuel. I'll be interested to see how Shmuel responds. And I'll just be interested to see what his character arc is like throughout this whole thing. Next, we move on, and we see little scenes from the Sermon on the Mount, which is how Season 2 was building up to the Sermon on the Mount, and it culminates with Jesus walking out upon the stage. And Season 3 is most likely going to open up with, actually, I think it's opening up with a flashback to the story of Matthew, but it's going to, by and large, open up with the Sermon on the Mount, and I think the probably first half of the season is going to largely be the aftermath of that Sermon on the Mount, where we just see Jesus' surge in popularity and what exactly is going to be happening with him. And fittingly, the whole trailer has different aspects of the Sermon on the Mount littered throughout it. And the first thing Jesus says here is, "I say to you, love your enemies." And he's going to say, "and pray for those who persecute you," which is exactly what we're going to go into in the next part here. But here we see Jesus standing here. Apparently he is off the stage now. You can see the stage in the background there. And now he's talking to a smaller group of people who are gathered around. Maybe he was just walking around as he talked, or he taught one thing and then maybe he went to another group and taught some more stuff, and maybe, I guess we'll just have to see how they play it out just to break up the whole thing, because I doubt that they're going to have him just doing the whole Sermon on the Mount in one 20-minute long segment. And then we just get a really cool shot of him looking up at him, which is really actually a beautiful shot. Really, this whole trailer is just showing how The Chosen is just really stepping their game up when it comes to cinematography. Every season they do that. And then he says, and pray for those who persecute you. And quite fittingly, we have two different people here. We have the persecuted and the persecutor, right? So the first one we have is Matthew, and this guy is going to go through quite the character arc this season. Like I said, I believe the very first scene of season 3 is going to be a flashback to Matthew as a former tax collector, where he was the persecutor. He was going around persecuting people. But right here, we see him in what seems to be a very nice bed. I would assume this is probably, I don't know if it's at his house though, because his house was a little bit nicer whenever we first saw it. So I don't know, maybe we didn't see his bedroom, and so actually I think we did see his bedroom. So maybe somewhere else, but this does seem like a fairly nice place. But notice what Matthew's wearing. He's not wearing his normal stuff. I think that this is going to be maybe a little bit later in the season where he is wearing clothes that are probably going to be making the disciples more comfortable, because I think he's going to have to wrestle through a lot of his own past failures and his own past sins in the season. And in this scene, it just seems like Matthew is a broken person. I don't know why he's crying, but he is crying. It looks like he's holding something in his hand. I'm assuming it is a rolled up piece of parchment from a scripture he's been studying. It could be the same scripture from the last season. I'm not totally sure, but it seems like he's holding it just bound up together, like he's squeezing it because something's either convicting him, he feels guilty for something he's done. I'm not totally sure. I think I'm leaning more towards the conviction side, or maybe other disciples have just not been responding well to him and the tension is overwhelming him. I don't know. But Matthew is definitely going through some major stuff right here. But then, not only do we have Matthew, the former persecutor, but right below we have John the Baptist in prison, and he is the one being persecuted. So that's why I'm saying how this whole trailer was edited really well, to where the things Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount couple really well with the stuff that we see. So as he's saying this, we have both a person who has persecuted people in the past and who is possibly facing persecution in the present, Matthew. You'll remember that at the end of the Sermon on the Beatitudes in season 2, he turned to Matthew and said, and blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, right? So we have that nice little parallel there. And then down below, we have John the Baptist, who is currently in prison, and he is going to be in prison until he meets his fate of dying, which I'm expecting that to possibly happen in this season, mainly because we know that according to the Gospels in their timeline, the feeding of the 5,000 happened shortly after John the Baptist was killed. It was actually John the Baptist's death and Jesus receiving news of it that caused him to leave to go to a desolate place, and whenever the crowds heard about it, they followed him. And so we know that the feeding of the 5,000 happens immediately after the death of John the Baptist, so I expect that we might see that in this season, and I'll be interested to see how graphic they go with that, because it is not a PG story in the Bible. And then we move on to another scene here where Jesus says, "Someone touched me." And this is probably my favorite shot in the entire trailer, just because from a cinematography perspective, it is just absolutely stunning. The visuals are amazing. So first off, we see Jesus. He is walking through this whole thing, and we see the one Pharisee who is Shmuel's partner. For some reason right now, his name is blanking on me, and that makes me feel really bad because I talked about him a lot in our previous videos. But we see him standing right behind Jesus, and that's interesting because as far as we know, he is not exactly one of Jesus's close friends. But what's presumably happening here is this is where Jesus is being led to the house of a man named Jairus because his daughter is sick. And maybe that Pharisee is going to end up being Jairus. I don't know. I know his name is not, it was not revealed to be Jairus in the past. We do know his name. For some reason, I'm just blanking on it. But we do know that Jairus, whose daughter was sick, is a ruler of the people, and he was probably one of the leaders in the synagogue. So it could be that they're retconning this a little bit, or just changing it to where maybe we're learning the guy's first name or something like that. And maybe that's why he's with him. Maybe his daughter is the one who is sick, and maybe that's why he needs help. But for some reason, he is the one traveling with Jesus here. And the reason why I say that they are traveling to visit Jairus' daughter is because this is the scene where a woman is going to touch Jesus' robes, and we're going to see that in a little bit in this trailer. So the woman is going to touch Jesus' robes, and she is going to be healed. This is the woman with the discharge of blood. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but this is that big scene right here where Jesus is surrounded by the crowds, and he's going to say, "Someone touched me," because he feels power go from him. And sure enough, on this bottom picture here, we see Jesus feeling the power leave him, and he looks kind of bewildered. And I could have gotten another screenshot. I didn't, just for the sake of time. But there's this really cool visual here where it kind of zooms in on Jesus, and almost the background around him kind of just warps a little bit, as it really just kind of allows you to focus on almost the anxiety that fills him in that brief moment where he realizes power has left me, almost like he's overwhelmed by the crowd. And you can even kind of see this to a degree where on the top screen, he is surrounded by people, but whenever you go to the bottom one, the people seem a little bit further back because of the reality distortion of just like the way that they zoomed in on him right here, where he realizes someone has touched him. And so we know from the Gospels that that moment happened on the way to visit Jairus and his daughter, where Jairus is currently leading him on the way there. And the way that the Gospel of Mark puts it is that he like really crams right in the middle. It's called a Markan sandwich, right? Where we have Jairus bringing Jesus to his daughter, and then on the way there, this woman touches Jesus and he heals her. And then immediately after that, he goes and he heals Jairus' daughter. And we're going to see a little bit of that scene in a little bit as well. So he says, someone touched me. And we have that brief moment, which is just my favorite moment in the entire trailer. And then that immediately cuts to another moment shortly afterwards where John's disciples, these are John the Baptist's disciples, they come to Jesus and they say, if you are really the one who is to come, or if we should look for someone else. And this is taken from a moment where John the Baptist is in prison, and it seems like John is experiencing a little bit of doubt because John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Messiah, and he believes Jesus is the king who was to come. He is the Messiah. He is confident about this, but at the same time, he is suffering and he is in prison, and he's wondering, hey, if you're the king, then why am I in prison? Why am I going through this? And so he sends some of his disciples to Jesus to question him. And that is exactly what we see happening right here. They come to Jesus, and this is really building up to the idea that John the Baptist is going to die in this season. And they're confronting Jesus, and we see everybody around there looking to see what Jesus is going to say, right? So one thing that the Chosen has been doing, which is a little bit different than the Gospels, but I see why they're doing it, is that they're making Jesus' declarations of his messiahship a lot more public a lot earlier on. Like there are a lot of places where in the Chosen, like Jesus just outright declared he is the Messiah very clearly to people. And he has also even declared that he's God. I mean, there was the moment in season 2, episode 1, where he just outright turns to John and says, I am, like God, basically. He says, I am. And there's a lot of places in there where in the Gospels, Jesus is a lot more subtle about it. And he really has this whole thing, people call it the Messianic secret, where he will tell people here and there that he's the Messiah, but he'll very quickly tell them not to tell anybody else about it, and he'll try to kind of keep it on the down low, mainly because he knows that if people know that he's the Messiah, then he's going to be put to death because he's doing things a little bit differently than how they would expect. And so Jesus really tried to keep it down the down low, but for the purpose of the Chosen, they're making it a little bit more out in the open, I think, mainly because for the purpose of telling a multi-season show, you've got to be building up to that climax from the very beginning, right? And if you're trying to place the seeds and lay the groundwork for Jesus ending up on the cross, you kind of need that pushback. And just for the drama of telling a TV show, you need to have that pushback where he is making these bold claims outright in public, where people are just hearing this and they're having to, wrestle through it, right? And so I get why they're doing it for the purpose of the show, and that really doesn't bother me at all, because the thing is, Jesus was saying from the very beginning that he was the Messiah, but he was saying it in a lot of veiled terms that kind of left it a bit ambiguous, right? And so personally, I've always viewed this particular moment with John's disciples and stuff as more of a private moment, but I don't really know. Right? It could have happened publicly, but Jesus is going to respond in a way that makes it very clear that, yes, he is the Messiah. And what's cool here is that, actually, let me just go on. Okay, so Jesus responds to them and says, go and tell John what you hear and see. And what they do here is absolutely brilliant when it comes to editing this trailer. Because if you're familiar with the Gospels, you know exactly what Jesus says. But they don't actually finish Jesus' statement here. Instead, they give you visuals that represent what Jesus told the disciples. Because whenever John the Baptist's disciples come before Jesus and they say, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? He says, go and tell John what you hear and see. The dead are raised, the blind see, the lame are healed, the lepers are cleansed. And he starts listing out all these things, primarily from the book of Isaiah, which on this channel we are doing a long series going through. So if you want to watch that, go and do that. But he's quoting the book of Isaiah. And he's referencing different things that are associated with the Son of David, the Messianic King. And he says, look at these things I'm doing. And he's using those symbols as a way to encourage John the Baptist. And so in the trailer here, once again, expert editing on I don't know who edits this stuff, but they did a great job. So we just hear Jesus saying, go tell John what you hear and see. And then we immediately cut to a scene where we have Jairus' daughter who is about to be raised. Jesus is removing the linen cloth from over her. And then we have who I assume to be Jairus' wife, the girl's mother, gasping, probably because Jesus just raised her. That's what I'm assuming is happening right here. And that is beautiful when it comes to what Jesus said to the disciples. Once again, we're not hearing what Jesus says to the disciples, but visually we see that being represented in how they're editing this together. And I just love stuff like that. And so Jesus said that the dead are raised. And then we cut to a scene where the dead are being raised. Right? And then we cut to another scene right here where Shula and Barnaby, who we've known them since season 1, episode 2, they were some of the friends of Mary Magdalene. Shula is a blind woman, and Barnaby is a man who is slightly crippled. And Shula says, who is it? Why did we stop? And Barnaby says, it's him. I don't know what's happening in the context of this scene, but in the way that the trailer is edited, what they're doing is once again expert. Because when Jesus responds to the disciples of John, he says, the dead are raised, the blind see, the lame are healed. And so we have a dead person who's about to be raised, and I don't know whether or not like Shula, the blind woman, is going to be healed, and I don't know whether Barnaby is going to be healed either, but at the very least, we have representatives of those categories, right? We have the dead person, we have the blind person, we have the lame person. That is really good editing, and I just love that. That is just absolutely fantastic. But once again, I don't know what the context of this is, but we do know for sure that Shula and Barnaby are encountering Jesus once more. They encountered him in season 1, they were present at the Sermon on the Mount at the end of season 2, and apparently they're going to encounter him right here, and the look in Barnaby's eyes would suggest that Jesus is doing something really powerful, and that, I don't know, this seems like a big moment here. Barnaby is typically a jokester, and he's a person who's just constantly cracking jokes, but right here, he seems genuinely moved by something that he sees. And Shula can't see it, but Barnaby is wanting to make it clear to her. Like they stopped for something, and I'll be interested to see what is made of that. We move on, and here we have Judas Iscariot officially identifying himself. And he says, I'm Judas of Iscariot. And we do see that these two moments do seem to flow directly into one another, because the scene on the bottom, you can see on top that Judas is wearing this little necklace here, and then on bottom you can see the outline of that necklace, and so this is definitely Judas from one side and then from the other side, so this seems like the same interaction. And this seems to be immediately after the Sermon on the Mount. You can see the stage in the background on the top photo. Judas is wearing the same clothes, Jesus is wearing the same clothes, and presumably right after the Sermon on the Mount, Judas comes and introduces himself to Jesus, and I think the look on Jesus' face says it all. Mainly because it's a very subtle look and it's understated, but in his eyes, this is just how Jonathan Rumi is just killing it as Jesus. I guess that was no pun intended, but he's killing it as Jesus, because you can see that there's concern and there's seriousness, but he recognizes that this moment is a lot more impactful than Judas does. Judas recognizes it's a big deal because he's getting to meet this guy who's like a local celebrity now, right? Jesus. But as he identifies himself, Jesus looks at him and he knows that this is the guy who's going to one day betray him. But he's not revealing that, right? It's not like the look isn't so overstated to where Judas is like, why are you looking at me that way? No, Jesus is just responding to him like you would to a normal person, but in his eyes you can see that there's something more. We also see here that the writers of The Chosen have chosen to go with the traditional perspective of what the word Iscariot means. There are all these different interpretations on what Iscariot means, and if you want to know more about them, you can actually go check out my Lives of the Apostles series, where I have done in-depth, multiple hour-long videos breaking down the lives of every single one of the 12 apostles, based off of what we know about them from Scripture, based off of tradition, and based off of just stuff that they've depicted in The Chosen. But there's multiple different ways people did interpret the name Iscariot. Some people think that he belongs to the group of Sicarii, which is actually a group of the Zealots. I don't personally hold to this. I agree with the people, the creators of The Chosen here, where I think that Iscariot means Ish Karioth, right? Man of Karioth, because the word Ish means man, Karioth is a city. And so he says, I'm Judas of Kerioth, and that is their interpretation for what exactly Judas Iscariot means. It is just a man from Kerioth, which was most likely a city down in the southern region of Israel, the land of Judah, right, or Judea. And so he introduces himself, Jesus is looking at him, and this is the first interaction between Jesus and his future betrayer. And I'm really excited to see how they portray Judas here. I'm sure that many people will be very uncomfortable with it because I fully expect and hope that the creators of The Chosen will portray Judas as a sympathetic character to where we identify with him and we resonate with him. And he's got to be a good, normal dude so that whenever he betrays Jesus, we are truly heartbroken by it. If they portray him as a mustache-twirling villain, that won't be good. And I don't think they're going to do that. Just based off of the last episode of Season 2, I think that we already have good confirmation of that. But yeah, I just think it's really cool. Okay, we move on. Directly after this, we cut from Judas introducing himself to Jesus to Judas sitting at what's kind of the head of the table with the other apostles. We have, 3, 6, 9 apostles visible here. The ones we don't see Simon Peter, right? We don't see... Okay, so who we do see? We see little James, we see Thaddeus, we see... I think that's Simon the Zealot, I think, behind him. Then we have Judas, we have Philip, we have Matthew, we have James and John, we have Andrew. So who we're missing is Simon Peter, we're missing Nathaniel, and we're missing one other person. I'm trying to think who it is off the top of my head. Oh, Thomas. We're missing Thomas because he's in the bottom picture, right? And so we see 9 of the different apostles here, and they're sitting before Jesus, and then it cuts to a group of them walking with Jesus, and in the background, Jesus is saying, I have chosen you 12 as my apostles. So presumably the other 12 are also in there. They're just not necessarily in this one particular shot, but they're probably all around there. And the reason I say that is because most likely this conversation is actually happening with Jesus saying it right here, because we're going to cut in a second to the way Nathaniel responds to this, and he is sitting off to the side in just a second, and so probably maybe over to the left here in this scene. And it seems like this is all happening in this actual room right here. So Jesus says, I've chosen you as my apostles, which is really cool. I'll be interested to see exactly, like, if they actually portray how it happened in the Gospels, because personally, whenever I've read the Gospels, that's always kind of like, if I've thought about portraying it in a TV show, it's probably more of an awkward way to portray things. Like, Jesus goes, he prays on a mountain, he comes back down, and he appoints the 12. The way that they've kind of portrayed it so far was a kind of natural growth where he has kind of specifically called each of these 12 people already. Whereas in the Gospels, it seemed to happen a little bit differently, where he did call specific people, like, like Peter and James and Andrew and John. Like, he did call them. He called Matthew. But at the time when he appointed the 12, it seems like there were just dozens, if not hundreds of people following him. He goes up on a mountain, he prays, he comes back down, and he appoints them. They might be doing that a little bit different in the show, which I'm totally fine with, because it's not that significant, right? We have to realize this is not claiming to be exactly the Bible. It is just a representation of the Bible, which is totally fine. And so I don't know how they're going to portray that. I think it'd be kind of cool if they did portray that. But Jesus does declare to them that he has chosen them as his apostles. The apostles, it means to be sent out, but it was a term specifically designated for specific people that Jesus kind of was giving authority, right? He was giving him, like, basically making them ambassadors, right? He's giving them his seal of approval, his authority to go out and actually preach this stuff. And so they're going to go out and do that. And I like that he says he's chosen them, right? That's the name of the show, The Chosen. The show is about them. He has chosen them in particular to function in this role. And so going forward, we are going to have a set of 12 people who we are tracking with, right? Seasons 1 and 2 were introducing us to all of them, and we had that time to just breathe and get to know them. But going forward, we have Jesus and the 12, which is really cool. Then we cut to them walking. And I don't know where they're heading. I don't know what they're doing. I don't have enough information off this. But I would say this is probably a little bit later on in the season, just because we do see that Matthew is wearing his clothing. Like, so you see in the top scene right here, we have Matthew in the background wearing his tax collector clothing, right? And so this would probably happen earlier on in the season where he's just appointing them. But later on, we see that Matthew's wearing his other stuff. And I don't know why he's going to end up changing those clothing. Probably because he realizes that him being a tax collector could be a stumbling block to other people. And so him wearing this fancy clothing would actually push people away and it would distract people from the gospel message. That's what I'm assuming they're going to do. I don't know. But here we have them going forward later on, and they're walking somewhere together. I don't know. All right. Nathaniel responds to this, and he says, I don't feel any different. And here we do see 2 of the other people, right? So we have, actually, I guess in this one scene, we have all of them accounted for. If we go back to this previous thing, we have 9 of the apostles right there sitting in front of Jesus, and then off to Jesus' left, went the wrong way. Off to Jesus' left, we have Nathaniel and Thomas sitting next to each other on this little ledge here, and then to Jesus' right is Simon Peter, right? Which he hasn't been called Peter yet. I don't know if that's happening in this season. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I have a feeling it's going to happen in this season. But that means that we kind of just have this is really not important at all, but we kind of have a layout for how this scene is kind of being broken down. So 9 of them are sitting in front of him. We got 2 to the left and then 1 to the right. Nathaniel responds and says, "I don't feel any different." And this is probably my favorite thing that Jesus says in the entire trailer. And he responds and says, "I don't need you to feel anything to do great things." This is one of those places where the creators of The Chosen have taken creative liberties, and they have put words in Jesus' mouth, right? Which you have to do if you're creating a TV show about Jesus, because if he only says the things he says in the Gospels, the show is going to be very short, or Jesus is going to be a very silent person. And so they have Jesus saying these things, but what they're saying is consistent with the message of the Bible, and I think what they're doing is they're teaching a specific message to people nowadays, right? So this is how The Chosen does an expert job of making what they're saying relevant, because Nathaniel is here. He just heard that he has been chosen by Jesus to be an apostle, and he says, "I don't feel different. It's not like I have superpowers going through me." I imagine that Jesus might have even told them that they are going to have the power to do all these things, and Nathaniel says, "I don't feel different." And Jesus says, "I don't need you to feel anything to do great things. God can do things through you, whether you feel it or not." And I think that sends a really good message just to us. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is what the creators were going for whenever they put that scene there. Like, there's like, you need to recognize it's not about what you feel, right? It's about who God is and what he can do. Your feelings really don't matter in regards to how much God can accomplish. God can accomplish something through somebody who's really feeling it and somebody who's not really feeling it. It's a matter of, do you genuinely have faith in the God who is, right? Feelings are good, and they can be good, but they're not adequate ways to interpret what exactly God is accomplishing. And so then we have Simon Peter looking over at Jesus and just like flashing that smile and be like, "Yeah, 100%, man." And I just really like where they're heading with the season. I think that this is really exciting stuff, and I hope that you're getting excited for it too, as I am. Then we cut to, this is the place where I actually couldn't really pick up on what Jesus was saying here. And so if you could tell what he was saying better, maybe you could help me out here. But it seemed like what he said is, "Are there stirring in your hearts?" And really, this is just part of one thing that he's building up to for the later parts. And I could tell what he was saying going forward, but this particular phrase right here, it seems like it started in the middle of a sentence or something like that, and I couldn't totally pick up on what he was saying. But it says like something along the lines of, are there stirring in your hearts, or are there stirrings in your heart? I'm not totally sure. If you could help me out in the comments, please do so. And as he's saying this, we start having just vignettes just going in and out as we just see, like, this is just voiceover, and we see different stuff happening. We have a scene on the top left where we have him preaching once again the Sermon on the Mount. So we're getting a lot of stuff, which I wouldn't be surprised if most of the things that we're seeing are towards like maybe the first 4 episodes of the show, primarily because I imagine they're still editing this show together, and they've probably done their most work on the first few episodes. That's typically also just how shows work whenever they release trailers. They release a lot from the first half so that the back half is more of a surprise. And so we got stuff from the Sermon on the Mount, and then we have 2 of the women disciples talking to each other. Mary seems to be crying, and I don't know exactly what's going on here. I know that one of the plot lines that we're going to be seeing with them over the course of the season is that they're going to open up some sort of business with Zebedee. I think it's like I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's going to be the women disciples are going to start some sort of business to help fund Jesus' ministry, which is consistent with what we see in the Gospels as well. And so I don't know what's going on here, but Mary seems emotional. They both seem emotional. Not sure what's happening. And it seems like, based on the background, I'm assuming they're just in somebody's house, but it seems like there's maybe some kitchen tools hanging from a wall or something. I don't know what's going on there. That'll be interesting. And then we have Eden showing up. I believe that's the first time we've seen her in this trailer so far. She's just looking off into the distance, probably from the same scene we're going to see in a little bit. And then we have our boy Atticus, right? Is that his name? Atticus? I've got his name later on in this. For some reason, I'm blanking on his name too. But he's riding on a white horse, and he's presumably going to somebody. That was really vague. He is riding on a white horse somewhere from some other place. I don't know. I can't speculate about it. I have no idea. But we're just seeing different shots of different characters. Oh, and I put this picture of Eden in there twice. Whoopsies. And Jesus says, in the middle of such division and unrest, so putting it together, are there stirrings in your hearts in the middle of such division and unrest? And we have these different scenes kind of just being contrasted here. We have Eden, and then right after that, we have Simon crouching down and Eden hugging him. I'm not sure what's happening there. Like, even just, like, they must be going through something very emotional. That's all I can say, because I don't know why Simon would be crouching on the ground right here. I don't know why Eden's hugging him, but it seems like Simon was the one already on the ground. Eden's the one crouching down to console him. And I don't know what they're going through, but it seems like Simon's going to go through some major stuff in this season too, because we have some stuff later on that's going to suggest that. So I don't know what's happening here, but we do see division and unrest in the sense of, this is where I have said multiple times, how they edited this trailer is expert, because I know that there's going to be some arguments and different stuff between Simon and Eden again in this season, which is cool. So we have division and unrest from a marital perspective, right? So just from a familial, internal, inside the household, we have division and unrest. But then we immediately go down and we see that there's also division and unrest politically speaking, right? So we have the social and familial, and then we have the economic and political aspects of things. We have the internal and the intimate, and then we have the external and the public. Two different types of division and unrest. We have division within the household, and we have division out in public, where we have, this is Alphaeus, the father of Matthew, who is being pressed against the door of his house, I believe, by a Roman guard. And I believe that this is actually from the same scene that they released earlier, just a few months ago, or just earlier this month, whenever it was. I don't remember what it was, but I have a video for it if you want to check it out. I believe that that is what this is from. And he is being pressed against there, and then I believe Matthew's going to walk up to him in just a second. It might be from like the first scene of season 3, unless I'm mistaken there. And then we have Gaius, who is walking with other Romans right here. I don't know where they're at, but I think that this might be on the new set that they just built over in Midlothian, Texas. The new set that they built for Capernaum, which is actually kind of cool. If so, that might be kind of one of our first shots of this set, unless I've missed some from the previous scenes. But yeah, so then we have Gaius, and Gaius is going to be significant in a little bit. But to move on real quick, so it says, are there stirrings in your hearts in the middle of such division and unrest? Is Father God being revealed to you? That's what I'm saying. Like, a lot of this, like, I'm not super confident on this, because this seems like it should be at the beginning of a sentence. Because the last part, in the middle of such division and unrest, is Father God being revealed to you? It seems like Jesus is saying that whenever you're going through very difficult times, God is revealing something to you about himself, which makes a lot of sense. To quote the words of Andrew Peterson, it says, in the song Always Good, this heartache is moving me closer than joy ever could. It seems like that's kind of the idea that Jesus is getting across in whatever he's saying here. I'm just not sure if I'm quoting him correctly, because I couldn't fully discern the words. But it's the idea that through difficulty, God reveals himself to us and actually draws us near to him and reveals himself to us. On top here, we have Eden submerging herself into what appears to be either a giant bathtub or what is most likely a mikveh. A mikveh was a big pool for Jewish cleansing, and we see that there are a bunch of candles around there. And I want to say, from a visual perspective, this is a beautiful shot of her submerging herself in the water. It's just a really nice shot. The practicality of all those candles, I don't know how that would have actually been. What I'm going to guess, and this is probably like, this is just because I overanalyze things. I'm assuming that they're in a dark room, and the creators of The Chosen just wanted to light the scene very beautifully, and so they put all these candles here. I don't think that historically there would have been this many candles if somebody's going into a mikveh, but it does make for a beautiful shot, and so that doesn't bother me in any way whatsoever, because why would it bother me? But really beautiful shot. I'm assuming she's going into a mikveh here, but she seems very distressed, or maybe not even distressed. Maybe she is actually... it's hard to read her emotions here. She is definitely looking towards God, right? I mean, we see her literally folding her hands and praying. I can't tell if this is supposed to be her, like, surrendering everything to Jesus. I don't totally know. I don't know if this is her... And it's not baptism, because baptism is something that is performed by another person upon you, but baptism is closely related to the Jewish ritual of cleansing oneself, right? That's actually one of the big things that John the Baptist was doing, is that the whole point was that you could not cleanse yourself. You have to be cleansed by another person, right? That's why you get baptized, because it represents you being cleansed rather than being able to cleanse yourself. And so she is submerging here, and maybe she's just taking a bath. I don't know, but most likely if she was taking a bath, she would not have clothes on, but I wouldn't expect them to put that in a Christian show because that would be entirely unnecessary. More likely, this is her dipping into the mikveh for ritual cleanliness, and so maybe, I mean, there's got to be probably a reason for this. She is presumably doing this because she has become unclean in some way. So maybe Eden herself is going to be struggling through some stuff. We know that she is going to get into some arguments with Simon, because I have seen some clips of that. But we also saw just in the last clip right there where she is consoling Simon, and she might be wearing the same exact clothing in both of those, actually. I'm not totally sure. If so, then this scene up there happened first, because you'll notice that the clothes are not all wet. But I don't know. She is dipping down there. I'll be interested to see what they do with Eden, because Eden's one of my favorite characters in the whole show. And it was good that they brought her back at the end of season 2, because I really loved just the Eden character. Really cool. And I like the dynamic between her and Simon. And then we also have these other shots down here where Jesus is talking to somebody who he is presumably going to heal. And I can't say confidently who this is. Maybe this could be, actually, now that I think about it, this could be Jairus coming to ask about his daughter. I don't know. There's multiple scenes in the Gospels where people confront Jesus one-on-one and they ask him something. And what we see here is that Jesus lifts the guy's face and looks into his eyes. But I'm not totally sure who this guy is. You could let me know in the comments, though, who you think this person is, because I'd be interested to know your opinion. But Jesus lifts up his eyes, and they're going to have a conversation, and either Jesus is going to heal this guy, he is going to go heal somebody related to this guy, or maybe this could be like the rich young ruler approaching Jesus. I don't know if that's who it would be, because the guy doesn't look like he's dressed in particularly fancy clothing. But it's possible. There's a lot of people who confront Jesus and ask him questions. I don't recognize him, though, so I really can't say too much, but I'd be interested to see what you say. This scene right here on the bottom right, we do see, I think that this scene probably ties particularly, this is probably right after the woman with the discharge of blood is healed. Mainly because we see that same Pharisee whose name is still evading me, and that really bothers me because I really like this character as well, but I just haven't watched the episodes recently enough to remember. But this Pharisee, he's still there, and this guy with the yellow hat, I'm assuming that is Jairus. That's who I genuinely think that guy is, because he was in the background of the other scenes way earlier when we were talking about it, because I recognized his yellow hat. I'm assuming that's Jairus, either that or it's just a guy who got a really cool wardrobe thing that draws attention to him. So I'm assuming that this is still on the way to Jairus' house, and this is probably the moment where the woman just got healed, and it looks like we see a palm tree in the background, which is not significant at all, but I thought I'd point it out. Okay, and then Jesus starts speaking some stuff that comes from, I believe, Matthew chapter 11, so it's not from the Sermon on the Mount, but if you go read the chapters that follow the Sermon on the Mount, you might have a better idea of what's coming in the season, because we do have Matthew chapter 11 here where he says, "Come to me all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." They use a different translation here. That's totally fine. He says, "Come to me," and we have different people coming to Jesus, right? We have this one person on top who is a child coming to Jesus, and I don't know who this is. I don't know if this is a moment where the disciples are running off kids, and Jesus says, "No, bring the children to me." That would make sense given the whole "come to me," and you have to come as a child to Jesus, right? That might be what they're going for there. I don't know, but it's a young boy who Jesus kisses on the forehead, and I'm just going to take a guess that is what that scene is, where it's Jesus calling forth a child and saying that you have to come like a child. If you want to come to me, you must be like a child. That would just kind of make sense for kind of how they're editing this. And then we have this moment where it looks like Simon is standing before John, and Simon seems to be going through some stuff. And so we have both Simon and Eden going through things. I don't know if what they're going through is related. I don't know. Obviously, if you're married and one person's going through something, you're going to be going through something too, because y'all are one flesh and you should be going through it together. But this is at a totally different scene, so I can't say whether this is related or not. But Simon does seem to be going through some stuff, and later on we're going to see a scene where John does pull Simon in and gives him a hug. And so John's actually going to console him which is kind of cool because we're just getting to see some camaraderie between the disciples growing. And we actually saw this a little bit in season 1 where Simon and John had some good interactions, even though in season 2 there were times where they really got on each other's nerves. And then we have this scene on the bottom here where we have a bunch of people lined up to go get water from a well. And right off the top of my head, I can't think of any moments in the Gospels that this would line up with, but I do not know. Also, we have to realize that if The Chosen is keeping with their tradition from the first 2 seasons, there might be scenes that we have from the Old Testament that crop up in here, where they might even have flash forwards and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that might not even be limited to just the Gospels that's going to show up in this particular season. But I don't know. It's a really nice shot, though, of just all these people in line. Once again, the cinematography of The Chosen never ceases to impress. We go on. So come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden. And then we cut to this scene with little James, who is crying. And I'm assuming that this is him standing before Big James, because later on in this trailer, as we'll see, you're going to see that Big James pulls Little James in for a big hug, and it seems like that would be this moment right here, where Little James is crying about something. I'm going to guess that probably they were out ministering 2 by 2, and maybe somebody said something that was very hurtful, or maybe they got rejected, or maybe Little James is in pain. I don't know. But this does not seem like happy tears. It seems like it's more sad tears, but obviously I don't know the context. Maybe it is happy tears. But little James is crying, and Big James is going to pull him in and give him a hug. Then we have Jesus with his hand on another person, and once again, I don't know who this guy is. Speculation can abound, but unless we had more context, I really can't say anything. But it seems like both these guys are heavy laden, right? Because I'm just going to assume that the editors knew what they were doing whenever they put these scenes here, and they're trying to give you little wink, wink, nudge, nudge, tying all of the themes together, kind of like we saw with the Beatitudes at the end of season 2. But then at the bottom of this, oh boy, this is exciting. Here we have Gaius, and he's not in his formal clothing, but he's just in casual clothing, and he's kneeling before somebody who is evidently sick. And this is where we get to see fan theories most likely being proven correct, where Gaius is most likely, I'm assuming, going to be this. He's going to be the centurion who says that his servant is sick and Jesus needs to heal him. Right, and so I think that we might have evidence that Gaius is going to be so influenced by Matthew that he is going to demonstrate remarkable faith in Christ, which is going to be really, really neat. I also just really like the background there. That pattern along the walls is very satisfying to me. But yeah, so I think that Gaius is going to be that guy, and I think that's what this is pointing towards, and this is probably the thing that stuck out to me most. Like, whenever I first saw the trailer, I was like, oh, that's so exciting. Then we move on. And Jesus says, and I will give you rest. And we have this guy who is breaking this staff. And if I'm not mistaken, these 2 people are the same person, right? The person on the top right of this screen right here is the same one who's breaking this staff right here. And originally, whenever I watched the scene, I was thinking that the guy was reenacting something that we saw that's actually from the Old Testament prophets, where a person breaks a staff. But now that I'm looking at it more closely, I realize that staff is a crutch. And so I think that this person was actually somebody who needed healing, and Christ healed him, which actually ties a lot more in to the whole I will give you rest thing. And this guy is literally breaking his crutch because he needs it no longer, right? And so Jesus probably healed him right here, and then the guy breaks his staff to demonstrate that he no longer needs that ever again, which I think is really cool, and it's a really dramatic moment, because the guy seems like he's being very aggressive here, but I think he's probably being aggressively grateful, if that kind of makes sense. And then we have Jesus standing in front of this crowd, and they all just sit down before him, probably to listen to him teaching. I don't know if this is at the Sermon on the Mount, or I don't know if it's later on. I'm assuming it's later on, just because we have a lot smaller groups just kind of scattered throughout, but I could be wrong there. Then we cut to the Pharisees gathered together. This actually might be the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish High Council. I don't know. But they are gathered together to talk about Jesus. And then we have the return of Shammai. And in the background, we have the guy who, there's a fancy name for him. But he's like basically the president of like local congregations and stuff. We've actually had him mentioned, and he showed up. The one from Galilee, at least, showed up in the beginning of season 2, somewhere in there. or somewhere in season 2 he showed up. I don't fully remember. And actually in season 1, I think. So I don't remember, but that's who that guy is in the background. But this guy is Shammai at the front, the one talking. And we saw him at the end of season 2. And what's really cool about Shammai is that this guy is actually a historical figure. There were 2 predominant schools of thought in Jewish thinking at the time of Christ. There was the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And Hillel was a guy who lived probably, I think, about 150 years before Christ. But Shammai was actually contemporaneous with Christ. And he was around at that time period. We never see them interacting in the Gospels, but it's really cool that they brought him into the show because most likely they would have interacted at some point. And he stands before them and he says, this scourge of false prophecy must stop. And he's most likely talking about Jesus and the probably growing faction that is Jesus' movement, because we have Jesus sending out all of his apostles to go do things. And so he says, we need to put an end to this thing. And everybody's listening. They're listening intently. They're leaning over. It'd be really cool. I don't know if they made any announcements. I would love it if Nicodemus came back in this season, and maybe he will, but they haven't marketed that way, and I'd be surprised if they didn't show him at least in a trailer if he was coming back. But within this group, we might have other famous people like Joseph of Arimathea, or just other just prominent people that we know were in the Sanhedrin at this time period. But once again, I don't know if this is the Sanhedrin or if it's just a gathering of Jews in Jerusalem, like Pharisees and stuff like that. I don't know. But he says the scourge of false prophecy must stop. And then we have a Pharisee who's confronting Jesus. And I can't remember if we've seen this Pharisee before. He might be the same one that showed up in season 2. I don't think it is. I think it's a different person. But he reminds me a little bit of the Pharisee who showed up in season 2 with the whole grain fields situation and with the man with the withered hand. But what I am going to guess at here is that this is actually the Pharisee or the synagogue leader in the synagogue in Nazareth. That's what I'm assuming here, because I think that this is building up to a big moment where Jesus is going to be kicked out. And the Pharisee says, Jesus, if you do not renounce your word. So he calls him Jesus, right? He doesn't call him rabbi. He doesn't say, it seems like there's this personal connection between him and Jesus to where he probably knows Jesus. And that's why, once again, I'm going to be more inclined to think this is the moment in Nazareth when he gets rejected. Jesus, if you do not renounce your words, we will have no choice but to follow the law of Moses. And this is really the big moment from the trailer, where it kind of just goes back and forth between Jesus and the guy, and then Jesus says, I am the law of Moses. So first off, he starts with the words I am, which is a big deal, but then he identifies himself as the law of Moses, which it places himself not only equal to the law, but above it, as if he is the authority, right? He is placing himself above Moses. And you would expect that this is probably following, Jesus probably stood before them. He was teaching. He even seems like he is wearing stuff to teach in the synagogue. He probably just quoted Isaiah chapter, 63, I think it is, where he says, the Spirit of the Lord's upon me. The stuff that he quoted in season 1, episode 3 to the children. He's going to quote that to the members of the synagogue. And I believe that this is the moment where the synagogue leader gets up. He confronts him and says, hey, if you don't calm down, we're going to have to follow the law of Moses. And he says, I am the law of Moses. So rather than renouncing his words, he actually heightens his words. And then I think they're going to march him out and they're going to go to throw him off a cliff. The top left scene right here, I think that is probably a different moment. But here we have Jesus very swag-like walking. He's opening double doors at the same time. And I really just like that moment. I don't know when it takes place. It could be at the same moment, but I'm thinking it's probably from a different moment. But what I do want to draw attention to is the bottom left scene, because look at who we see in the background. It's our buddy Lazarus, who we haven't seen in the show so far, but we did see, and we were introduced to him in the Chosen Christmas special, which was in theaters last December. And so as I was taking these stills, I was like, oh, that's Lazarus in the background, which once again would probably incline me to think that this is taking place in Nazareth, because Lazarus, we know, is a close friend of Jesus. Lazarus didn't live in Nazareth. Lazarus actually lived down in Bethany, which is actually just right outside Jerusalem. But this might explain where their friendship comes from, right? We might actually, we know that we're going to see Lazarus throughout the season. We have evidence of it right here. I don't know what we're going to see. I don't expect him to die. So that scene at the beginning that we're going to see again in a little bit, where there's a tomb, I don't think Lazarus is going to die in this season, because I think they're going to prolong that, because really the resurrection of Lazarus was one of the final straws when it came to the people wanting to kill Jesus. And so I think they're going to save that probably for season 5. But they're letting us get to know Lazarus so that he's familiar to us whenever he actually does die. And I'm assuming he is actually up there probably visiting Jesus' family when Jesus is in Nazareth. That's where I'm assuming all this is coming from. But I could be totally wrong. I have no idea. Like I said, I'm just a fan watching this, trying to interpret it, wanted to draw attention to it. All right. Yes, Atticus. Here he shows up, and he says, "You're here for Jesus of Nazareth." First off, we have a cut to people showing up, most likely for the feeding of the 5,000. That's what I'm assuming. This could be a shot from the Sermon on the Mount, but I think the Sermon on the Mount thing was different. So I think this is people showing up for the feeding of the 5,000. But then Atticus is talking to somebody, and he says, "You're here for Jesus of Nazareth." And I'm assuming that these two scenes do go together. Every time it cuts from one scene to another, you could always assume that this could take place at two different things. But on the left here with Atticus, it does seem like he is at the new set that they built, which is really cool. On the right, I don't know if they're at that same set, because it looks like there's some mountains in the distance, and I know that the set is in Midlothian, Texas, and I've been to Midlothian, Texas, and there are no mountains. So there could be a green screen thing here, or I don't know what, they could be doing different stuff here. I don't know who this Roman guy is. I'm not totally sure. People have speculated. I've heard people already talking about it could be Herod Antipas or something like that. I don't think that this would be Herod Antipas. I don't think he would be here to see Jesus right now. I don't totally know. But it could be a Roman official who came looking for Jesus, seeking help or something, right? And so there's really a lot of places this could go, and we've got to realize a lot of my speculation is coming strictly from the Gospels, but the whole point of The Chosen is that they're kind of expanding on stuff, right? And so there are going to be storylines, like Atticus was not a person in the Gospels. That is a made-up character. And so really, I wouldn't be surprised if this person's also a made-up character, something like that. I don't totally know, but it's good to see Atticus back. We move on, and we have this other guy who, I don't know, maybe y'all can correct me in the comments. This guy looks super familiar, but I don't believe we've seen him before. I don't believe. But this guy is, I'm assuming, from a flashback, because we do have Matthew inside the tax collector's booth, and I'm not expecting Matthew to go back to his tax collecting, because that would be kind of a weird thing to have him do. So I'm assuming this is a flashback, and we've got a guy confronting Matthew saying, "More valuable than gold, more precious than rubies." What I'm going to assume is that this is a guy who began kind of, maybe he was trying to preach to Matthew a little bit, maybe just trying to get into Matthew's head about the kingdom of God. I don't know. What he's saying there actually sounds very familiar to Proverbs 31, so it seems like maybe a guy giving him advice on dating or something like that, on pursuing somebody, but I don't think that's what's going on here. I think that he's probably talking about the kingdom of God, or talking something more religious sounding, and so I think this is a flashback where maybe somebody's trying to reach Matthew, and maybe it's kind of showing us some other little tidbits of things that kind of helped Matthew see the change in his ways. Because like I said, we're going to see flashbacks of Matthew whenever he was a lot more cruel as a tax collector. We know that for sure, but we don't know what's going to get him to eventually be the person that we met at the beginning of season 1. Because at the beginning of season 1, he was a lot more sympathetic, right? He was not an outright villainous tax collector. He was a lot more sympathetic. And so we need to see that arc. And so I imagine that this guy's going to be kind of instrumental in that, but I don't know if we've met this guy before. Here we see Quintus, and he says, "Force them out. We are still Rome." And on the top, we have Andrew and Philip being taken out and kicked out of probably a local synagogue or something like that because of them teaching about Christ. And then on the bottom, I don't know, like, we have seen this kind of little outside shot of Jerusalem there. I believe that's Solomon's portico or something like that, at the temple. But I'm not sure really what's going on there, because I'd have to really zoom in, and I'm just not zooming in. And then we have Quintus talking to somebody. I'm assuming it might be Gaius that he's talking to here, but I'm not entirely sure. It just seems more like that would be a conversation between Gaius and them, and they're saying, "Force them out." Who is them? I don't know. But somebody is needing to be forced out, presumably the disciples, if we're just kind of going with how these things are all coupled together. And then we have this shot, which just kind of goes from a bunch of different things, and there's no audio over this part, just there's music, which is great music. But on the top here, we have Jesus being escorted out of probably Nazareth, and the guy on the top left, I'm trying to think where I've seen him for. Is he not the guy from Cana? Was he not in the wedding at Cana, like was he not one of the dads? That would make a lot of sense. I could be wrong there. I didn't do any preparation before this video. I just kind of sat down and started talking. other than making this like little slideshow here. I think that's the actor from the wedding at Cana, which once again would tie this together with the Nazareth thing. And look in the background, and who do you see? It's the Pharisee from earlier, right? And so I think that kind of does confirm that that was the Nazareth thing. We immediately cut to Mary, who is once again weeping. I don't know whose chest she is crying into there. I think that's Lazarus probably. I think, let me go back. What is Lazarus wearing in that previous shot? Yeah, see, Lazarus is wearing like that multicolored tunic there. So this is Mary crying into Lazarus's chest. Man, I feel like a little super sleuth here. This is kind of fun. I don't really usually do this type of stuff, so this is kind of fun. So Jesus is being escorted out of Nazareth. He's going to be thrown out. And if that is the, man, I feel bad for blanking on this. If that is the guy from the wedding at Cana, how sad is it that he is being one of the ones to escort Jesus out? And Jesus, you can see the look on his face that he feels the rejection. And then, I'm going to skip over the left one real quick. The bottom right, we have these two moments between Jesus and Mary. I'm assuming that's, on the very bottom, we have them holding hands, and I think that's Jesus and Mary. It could be other people, but the clothing looks like it's the same color of Jesus's, and the embroidery and stuff looks like it's the same as Mary's on this other thing, where they're hugging each other. And it seems like these two moments might be related because the stuff that Mary is wearing around her shoulders and everything on the bottom picture is the same as what she has on her shoulders on the top one. So I'm assuming that these are moments closely related. Maybe this one is earlier in the day, and then later in the day, maybe Jesus comes to her, and this is probably a reunion moment where they just hug each other, and it's evening time now. But to the left here, this is a moment that we saw at the very beginning of the trailer, right? Where Jesus sees a tomb and he walks up to it and he touches the stone. And like I said, some people have speculated that this might be Lazarus's death. I really doubt we're going to see that in this season. I just do not expect that at all. If we do, I'd be very surprised. But I do think what we're seeing here is Jesus comes across a tomb that he knows looks very similar to his own. Maybe there's going to be somebody in it that is going to be significant, but I personally think that there's just a moment where they come across a tomb. I don't fully know beyond that, but that's the scene we saw earlier. Okay, and then we go back to Jesus, and he's quoting the Sermon on the Mount again, and he says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man," and that's all we're going to get in the trailer, but it's going to say, who builds his house upon the rock, right? I was actually just studying this with my discipleship group last night. That's kind of fun. So everyone then who hears these words of mine, and as he's saying this, we cut to different scenes. We have that same scene from earlier where we have John and Simon. Simon looks pretty beat up, and John comes forward and hugs him. And so I think that's the same scene from earlier. And then we have another scene from earlier where we have little James and big James. And you have, once again, James crying. He's holding his staff, just like we saw earlier. And then we have big James grabbing him and lifting him up into a big old bear hug. And so I think that those weren't accidentally paralleled because we saw those scenes earlier. We have them again. And it's just tying these things together. And then on the bottom right, we have a hand reaching out to grab that seat, right? The tassels underneath a person's robe, or hanging from a person's robe. And I believe that this is probably the hand of the woman with the discharge of blood. And I think that this is the moment right before that moment we saw earlier where Jesus says that someone has touched my robes. And, like that, or somebody touched him. Also, this is a totally random comment that is not necessary at all, but I just want to say the person whose hand is reaching out there has very nicely manicured fingernails. Very good. Good job. But yeah, so I think that's the hand of the woman with the discharge of blood reaching out to grab that. And then he continues speaking, and does them will be like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. We have these two moments between Simon and Eden where they are holding each other. Eden is in her more traditional clothing, like just, she's not in that white robe that we saw before. And so this is definitely a different moment. Maybe it's the next day, maybe it's earlier. I don't know. And then down below, we have a moment where we have Shula, Barnaby, Zebedee, Salome, and probably James and John, all gathered at the house of Zebedee, presumably, and they are raising up a toast for something. I don't know what for, but they're doing it. And then over here to the right, we have everybody gathering together, and this is either Sermon on the Mount or Feeding the 5,000. I don't know which one it is, but it's one of those. And he says, I am the one... so then we cut to another thing, right? So he says the building a house upon the rock thing, and then he says, I am the one who caused their hunger, I should be the one to feed them. And here we have short little glimpses of the feeding of the 5,000. So we have them opening up the basket, And here we have them being amazed because of how much food is in there, right? Because there is a lot more than 5 loaves and 2 fishes in that basket. But when you go to the right, you'll see that we have Andrew, Judas, Matthew, and Thomas, all 4 being surprised by this. But to the top right, we actually have another person looking on, and I'm assuming that this is the boy who brought them the basket to begin with. And then you go down to the bottom left, and you actually see how many baskets are filled, and we see just, 4 in that pic? No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this picture alone, and we know there's going to be 12 left over, which is really cool. And then we have a shot of Jesus looking around to the apostles. I don't know if it's from the same scene or if it's from another one. This could be when he's sending them out. I have no idea. And then we have another scene, and this is really just bringing the trailer to its end, where we have 2 disciples both reacting, that we've got one handing out the stuff to everybody, and then we've got Judas over here, and he is just astonished by what's happening, and he just seems like super excited to be part of this. And then we have this money shot of the feeding of the 5,000, and it's kind of like a Where's Waldo picture, where you can actually see Matthew. I don't know, can I use my mouse here? Oh, I can use my mouse. Look, Matthew is right there, presumably, and I think that might be Thomas over there, and then Thaddeus, maybe? There's Nathaniel up here. There's little James, right? So we see all the different apostles going through, handing out food, and you're just kind of spotting them, which is just kind of fun. I just kind of want to play Where's Waldo now, but that would just waste our time. And so we have this moment feeding the 5,000, and then it cuts to The Chosen Season 3. And then after it says The Chosen Season 3, it cuts once more to Jesus, who is speaking, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And the way that he's saying this has a lot more anger behind it, which makes you wonder what the context of him saying this will be. And there we have The Chosen Season 3 trailer broken down. Man, that was a long breakdown. I apologize for taking so long, but I would love to hear what all guesses you have for what we're going to see in Season 3. And as they release more trailers, you can definitely expect me to break them all down. You can expect me to probably do exactly what I did right here. And whenever the episodes start coming out, I'll do very similar things and be breaking those down as well. The Chosen Season 3 episodes 1 and 2 are coming to theaters this November, so I hope that you're excited to all go see that with us and with me. I'm so excited to go see it. I will be doing reviews. I'll be doing breakdowns just like I always do. Until then, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you know when other videos like this are coming out, and just make sure that you comment below and let me know what you think about this trailer. Did you like it? What did I miss in this trailer that you wanted to point out? Don't be afraid to correct me. I don't mind being corrected. That's totally fine. Until then, my name's David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy, and I will see y'all next time. Bye-bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.